So the Radhanite Jews on the Silk Road, there were many different religions in control of different areas during different time periods. Within these religious groups, there were subcategories of people who shared the same beliefs and traveled similar routes. Judaism was a very important religion on the Silk Road. Within the religion, there were many different groups of Jews who had their own role during this time period. One such group of Jews were called the Radhanites. While the meaning of the term Radhanite is unknown, some historians believe it refers to the Rhone River Valley in France. This would make sense because that area of France was where the majority of Radhanite merchants lived and began their Silk Road travels. And if we look at the Rhone River Valley, we have the city of Lyon on this river. And if you remember in the video about the Herod kings, we had Herod Antipas and Herod Archelaus, who were banished to the city of Lyon in Gaul. And after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, we had a mixture of Idumean conversions and Jews moving to this valley. I feel like I need to take the time to explain to those people who perhaps don't know that in the Temple of Jerusalem in the time of Christ, the priesthood and I guess the Sadducees, who have been shown to be infiltrated from the Idumean converts, and the Jews, because it was the southern kingdom of Judah, the people that came back to Jerusalem, and they brought with them the Babylonian Talmud. And this is not inspired by God or from the ancient fathers or prophets. It's just a bunch of man-made rules or interpretations of the laws of God. And it was through these laws, or through the law, that loopholes were able to be created. So they couldn't take the moral laws of God and see them for what they were. They tried to create loopholes, and if this wasn't legal, then we can get away with doing this, or we can do that. And some of the allowances within the Talmud are extremely corrupt. And this is what Jesus was talking about to the Pharisees and the priests of the temple, that they were whitewashed tombs and sons of their father, the devil, that they were not following God's laws of creation or laws of nature that are innate. As Jesus came to teach, the laws of God are written in your heart, and if you can't do them naturally, then just following law is the wages of your mistakes will be death. And that's a spiritual death. It's these people, they couldn't understand the spiritual man. And everything was about laws and rules and loopholes within those laws. Not only that, the Babylonian Talmud was full of Kabbalah and Babylonian mystery religion. There were two Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. So I'll just read this here on Wikipedia just to give a brief understanding of it. So the Talmud is the central text for Rabbinic Judaism and the primary source of Jewish religious law, the Halakha, and Jewish theology. Until the advent of modernity in the nearly all Jewish communities, the Talmud was the centerpiece of Jewish cultural life and was foundational to all Jewish thought and aspiration, serving also as the guide for the daily life of Jews. These are a compilation of writings of commentaries on the Torah that comes down from the captivity in Babylon. So I'll just read this blog here, or this article here. A sad sample of Talmudic teachings violating both the letter and the intent of the Holy Word of God. It says the Talmud reflects these same oral traditions which later became Judaic orthodoxy. It reflects the Pharisaic teachings which Christ condemned and which later they even claimed to come from an oral law given at the same time as the written Sinai covenant in order to give the Talmud equal credibility to Holy Scripture, thereby blasphemy, asserting a special authority to itself, even above the holy written word of God as taught today. Rabbinical Judaism holds the 5 books of Moses, called the written Torah, have always been transmitted in the parallel with an oral tradition. 2 guides, 2 laws were given to Moses at Mount Sinai. The first, known as Torah, Biktav, or the written law, is composed of only the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy, historically and biblically, a very inaccurate statement. For instance, Deuteronomy was given in Transjordan 38 years after Sinai. These books are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. The second law given to Moses at Sinai, known as Torah, Shebialfei, is the exposition of the written word as relayed by the scholarly and other religious leaders of each generation. The oral law is, in some sense, the more authoritative of the two. The traditions of the oral law are considered as the basis for the interpretation and often for reading of the written law. The Mishnah was redacted around the year 200 CE AD by Yehuda ha-Nasi, Judah the Prince. Rabbinic commentaries on the Mishnah over the next 3 centuries were recorded mostly in Aramaic and were redacted as the Gemara. The Mishnah and the Gemara together formed the Talmud. Although Judaism claims to base itself on the written word of God given to Moses, it actually understands this only in terms of the Talmud. Tragically, the Talmud effectively neutralizes the precious purpose of the commandments of God, which is why the Lord Jesus spoke in such damning terms of the teachers of these oral traditions, which continue among us in the synagogue and religious Jewish community today. The Talmud itself consists of 2 parts: the oral law, codified, the Mishnah, and the commentary on this, called the Gemara. As noted above, Jewish tradition asserts an absolute status of their oral law, the Mishnah, by claiming it was given by God at Sinai, at the same time as most Mosaic scriptures of the Sinai covenant law. The Mishnah is the written summary of the oral law codified by Rabbi Judah the Prince, Yehuda ha-Nasi, in the 2nd century AD. Over the next 300 years, Jewish teachers debated and expounded on the Mishnah. These debates and commentaries were compiled into what is called the Gemara, also called Talmud in a more restricted use of term. Discussions of the Jewish sages from Palestine are contained in the Jerusalem Talmud, edited by the disciples of Rabbi Yehohanan in Tiberias in the 4th century AD. In Mesopotamia, the Babylonian Talmud was compiled by Rabbi Ashi and Ravina in the 5th century AD and is traditionally considered to be more extensive and authoritative. Sadly, some Zionist Christian leaders today, such as John Hagee, Cornerstone Church, San Antonio, Texas, ignorantly teach that as a child the Lord Jesus was trained in the Mishnah, even though it was only codified long after Judaism had formally rejected the gospel of Christ in the rulings of Gamaliel II, 100 AD, great-grandson of Hillel, the grandson of Gamaliel I, that all Jews should daily recite a prayer against heretics directed at Jewish Christians, thus excommunicating those holding the understanding of the Tanakh, Old Testament, Holy Scripture, as taught by the Lord Jesus and his faithful. A particular example of Talmudic perversion and undermining of God's word to Israel is the so-called Prose Bull of Rabbi Hillel, which Jewish traditions made authoritative in the 2nd century AD. The Prose Bull allows the lender-creditor to avoid God's sabbatical year cancellations of debts owed, which God had strictly commanded, by formally transferring responsibility for debt collected to a religious court to act on behalf of the creditor, thus destroying the very purpose of this commandment of the Lord in Deuteronomy 15:2, which was to protect the borrower from the bondage of long-term debt. Further examples of the perversion of God's purpose are Talmud references, sample Pharisaic corruptions of morality. Moed Katan 17. If a Jew is tempted to do evil, he should go to a city where he is not known and do the evil there. Erubin 21. Whosoever disobeys the rabbis deserves death and will be punished by being boiled in hot excrement in hell. Sanhedrin 57. When a Jew murders a Gentile, Catherine, there will be no death penalty. What a Jew steals from a Gentile, he may keep. A Jew need not pay a Gentile the wages owed him for work. The Gentiles are outside the protection of the law, and God has exposed their money to Israel. If an ox or an Israelite gores an ox of a Canaanite, there is no liability. But if an ox of a Canaanite gores an ox of an Israelite, the payment is to be in full, and so on. Some special Talmudic hostilities towards Christianity was the text of the first persecutor in human history. So Jesus was a bastard born of adultery. Mary was a whore. Jesus, Balaam, was an evil man. Jesus was the magician and a fool. Mary was an adulteress. Shabbat, and this is where these tarot cards talk about the fool. Christians are allied with hell, and Christianity is worse than incest. When Messiah comes, he will destroy the Christians. And the Sanhedrin 90, those who read the Gospels are doomed to hell, and so on. Yet, it had long before been specifically written in the word of God to Israel, "You shall not add to the word that I command you, nor take from it, that you may keep commandments of the Lord your God that I command you." It is significant that the proselytizing zeal of the Pharisees, which Jesus so strongly condemned, effectively prepared the way in the Arabian Peninsula for the work of Muhammad and the rise of the Islamic religion with its associated extremism. And this is why I have a go at the Puritan movement in the last video I made, because this Puritan movement is a movement of extremism, and it's almost Talmudic in its beliefs and its harshness towards people, which Jesus came to preach the opposite of, he who cast the first stone, and removing the log from your own eye before you move the splinter from another's. So, as the Lord Jesus had himself appropriately said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across the sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourself." The voice of the Lord Jesus Christ to Israel was a call to restore the original intent of God's commandments to illuminated by God's revealed character. It just says here that it is worthy to note that in December 1977, the modern state of Israel passed a law making it a crime punishable with 5 years imprisonment for anyone to attempt to convert, evangelize a Jew, which crime includes even the giving of the New Testament. And, this is why I also like to bring up this Roman Piso story, which originated from the book of Bruno Bauer, who, it seems pretty clear to me, has Rothschild links, and his surname is a Rothschild name. And it's tied in with the Communist Manifesto of Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, who were the students of Bruno Bauer. So, despite the fact that I am going into genealogies of the Herod family, and the Vespasian theory is tied in with the Roman Piso, I guess, conspiracy, if you want to call it that. But what I've found is that despite this lineage, I can find lineage of the Herods through the Pergamon line of Carax of Pergamon, who was the priest in the temple of Asclepius, which was the medical god, that the Herod family interbred into the Roman aristocracy. They had also bred into the Parthian aristocracy, and they were only marrying their own. So what I'm trying to point out is that this dragon, this red Idumean Edomite dragon that gives the power to the beasts of the earth, is what is behind this banking elite and the royal families that benefit from their power. The Ashkenazi Jews, I will explain later about their conversion and who they are. But they're definitely big players along with the dragon. This would make sense because the area of France was where the majority of Aragonite merchants lived and began their Silk Road travels from. These Jewish merchants were very important for maintaining trade connections on various areas on the Silk Road, specifically in the Mediterranean. When the Roman Empire fell and Islamic caliphates began to gain more power, the Radhanites were a welcome trade partner for all. While Christian merchants on the land and vessels in the water were often not allowed to enter certain cities or ports, the Radhanites were always seen as a neutral group of people to trade with, who wouldn't start battles or cause conflicts among other religious groups. The Radhanites were a group of very intelligent merchants. Most of them spoke multiple languages to help them trade easier, including Persian, Greek, Arabic, Spanish, Slavic, and Franc Old French. They also helped start an early system of banking on the Silk Road by using letters of credit, instead of having to transport large amounts of money in its true form. This Jewish group was known for trading and buying many different items, including spices, perfumes, jewels, silk, steel weapons, and slaves. They also have been given credit by some historians for introducing paper making and Arabic numerals to Europe. So we can see that this is where the beginnings of these court bankers start on the Silk Road. And not only that, we have paper money and this promissory note system of money that was easily manipulated into the system we have today, that is no longer backed by anything of value, but is just simply created out of thin air. But as we have seen with other groups on the Silk Road, most powerhouses fell after a certain amount of time. This was not different with Radhanites. When the Tang dynasty fell in 908, chaos fell across all of Asia and parts of Europe. Trading ports and towns were destroyed, and the Frank Empire, under which the Radhanites lived in Europe, broke apart into smaller states. The Italians also became big competitors against the Radhanites in the Mediterranean. Most of Europe fell, and the fall of the Radhanites, because without them, many spices that had been brought in by them from Asia were no longer available. I don't know how they can say this because they don't know that much about them. And when we have a look at the Italian competitors and we move on to Venice, we'll see that the same people were controlling the trade there. The Radhanites were a very important group on the Silk Road. They go to show how much of an influence the Jewish people had on the Silk Road and what they did for people in Europe and Asia. Without the Radhanites, the world would not be the way it is today. They helped forge connections between different religious groups, helped spread Judaism to different parts of Asia, Europe, and helping bring about a new numbering and banking system. They were key players on the Silk Road. And so I believe that these particular Jews were of the Edomite origin, having learnt their trade along the Silk Road previously as merchants. Edom and Nabatea were big powerhouses for hundreds of years prior to Rome on the Silk Road. And as we can see, we have the merchants in the temple, and these groups are very big players in this money changing, taxation, tax collectors, and trading and merchantism. From the Jewish Virtual Library, Lyon is the capital of the Rhône department in East Central France. According to medieval Jewish legend, one of the 3 boats loaded with Jewish captives taken during the siege of Jerusalem docked at Lyon. Herod Antipas, Tetrarch of Galilee, was exiled to the city by Caligula in 39 CE. Lyon seems to have had a Jewish population in both the 1st and 2nd centuries. Little more is known about Jews in Lyon until the beginning of the 9th century. However, when there was a large, prosperous, and powerful Jewish community in the city, the Jews owned slaves and also employed Christian laborers in their homes and their commercial and agricultural enterprises. So here we have an article about the Radhanites. The Radhanites, also Radhanites in Arabic, were medieval Jewish merchants. Only a limited number of primary sources use the term, and it remains unclear whether they are referred to as a specific guild or to a clan or generically to Jewish merchants in the Trans-Eurasian trade network. Jewish merchants operated in trade between the Christian and Islamic worlds during the early Middle Ages, approximately 500 to 1000. Many trade routes previously established under the Roman Empire continued to function during that period, largely through their efforts. Their trade network covered much of Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of India and China. Several etymologies have been suggested for the word Radhanite. Many scholars, including Barbia de Maynard and Mosh Gill, believe it refers to a district in Mesopotamia called the Land of Radhan in Arabic and Hebrew texts of the period. Others maintain that their center was the city of Ray, Ragus in northern Persia. Cecil Roth and Claude Cahen, among others, make the same claim about the Rhône River Valley in France, which the Rhodanus in Latin. They later claim that the center of the Radhanite activity was probably in France, as all their trade routes began there. Still, others maintain that the name derives from the Persian term Ra, way, path, and Dan, one who knows, meaning one who knows the way. English language or Western sources added the suffix "ite" to the term, as is done with ethnonyms or names derived from place names. The activities of the Radhanites are documented by Ibn Khordadbeh, the postmaster, chief of police, and spymaster for the province of Jibal under the Abbasid Caliph al-Mu'tamid, when he wrote Kitab al-Masalik wal Mamalik, Book of Roads and Kingdoms, in about 870. He described the Radhanites as sophisticated and multilingual. He outlined 4 main trade routes utilized by the Radhanites in their journey. All 4 began in the Rhone Valley in southern France and terminated on the east coast of China. Radhanites primarily carried commodities that combined small bulk and high demand, including spices, perfumes, jewelry, and silk. They also described as transporting oils, insects, steel weapons, furs, and slaves. These merchants speak Arabic, Persian, Roman, and the Frank, Spanish, and Slav languages. They journey from west to east, from east to west, partly on land, partly by sea. They transport from the west eunuchs, female slaves, boys, brocade, castor, marten, and other furs, and swords. They take ships from Faranja, France, on the Western Sea and make for Farama, Palasium. There they load their goods on camelback and go by land to Al-Kolzum, Suez, and a distance of 25 farsakhs. They embark in the East Sea and sail from Al-Kolzum to Al-Jar and Al-Jeddah. Then they go to Sind, India, and China. On their return from China, they carry back musk, aloes, camphor, cinnamon, and other products of the eastern countries to Al-Kolzum and bring them back to Farama, where they again embark on the Western Sea. Some make sail for Constantinople to sell their goods to the Romans. Others go to the palace of the king of the Franks to place their goods. Sometimes these Jew merchants, when embarking from the land of the Franks on the Western Sea, make for Antioch at the head of the Orontes River, thence by land to Al-Jabia on the bank of the Euphrates, where they arrive after 3 days' march. There they embark on the Euphrates and reach Baghdad. Hence they sail down Tigris to Al-Abola. From Al-Abola they sail for Oman, Sindh, Hind, and China. These different journeys can also be made by land. The merchants that start from Spain or France go to Sas al-Aqsa in Morocco, and then to Tangier, whence they walk to Kairouan and the capital of Egypt. Thence they go to the Ramla, visit Damascus, Al-Kufa, Baghdad, and Al-Basra, cross Ahvaz, Fars, Kerman, Sind, Hind, and arrive in China. Sometimes also they take the route behind Rome and passing through a country of the Slavs arrive at Kamlij, the capital of the Khazars. They embark on the Georgian Sea, arrive at Balkh, betake themselves from there across to Oxus, and continue their journey towards Yurt, Toguzgaz, and from there to China. During the early Middle Ages, the Islamic polities of the Middle East and North Africa and the Christian kingdom of Europe often banned each other's merchants from entering their ports. Corsairs of both sides raided the shipping of their adversaries at will. The Radhanites functioned as neutral go-betweens, keeping open the line of communication and trade between the lands of the old Roman Empire and the Far East. As a result of the revenue they brought, Jewish merchants enjoyed significant privileges under the early Carolingians in France and throughout the Muslim world, in fact, that sometimes vexed local church authorities. Now I'm just going to stop there and I just want to remind you about the beasts of Revelation. And it's the dragon, which I believe is the Edomite converts, the heads being the Herod, but the family being of Edom, and the beast. So we have the beast of the sea, we have the beast of the earth, and they both gain power from the dragon. And if we look at this story, who is gaining power from these Jewish merchants or these dragon merchants and their banking skills? And we have the kings of the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire of the Sultan and the Caliph. So I'm going to go into this further later, but I do believe that this beast of the sea is the Holy Roman Empire, which came up out of the sea, and that this beast of the earth is actually belonging to the Ottoman Empire, and that it looks like a lamb because its Islamic faith looks lamb-like, like Jesus, who was the lamb, or it looks like a gentle faith, but it speaks like a dragon. And it has 2 horns, which I believe one horn is the Caliph, and I believe the other is the Sultan. But I'll go into that further and explain why I believe that. So with the fact that they are convenient go-betweens between the Christian and the Muslim world, shows that there was a really big reason for the Ashkenazi Jews from the Scythian Empire to convert to Judaism and not to Christianity or Islam. So I'll get back to that later, but I'll continue reading. While most trade between Europe and East Asia had historically been conducted via Persian and Central Asian intermediaries, the Radhanites were among the first to establish a trade network that stretched from Western Europe to Eastern Asia. More remarkable still, they engaged in this trade regularly and over an extended period of time, centuries before Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta brought their tales of travels on the Orient to the Christians and the Muslims, respectively. Indeed, Ibn Battuta is believed to have travelled with the Muslim traders who travelled to the Orient on routes similar to those used by the Radhanites. While traditionally many historians believe that the art of Chinese papermaking had been transmitted to Europe via Arab merchants who got the secret from prisoners of war taken at the Battle of Talas, some believe that Jewish merchants such as the Radhanites were instrumental in bringing papermaking west. Joseph of Spain, possibly a Radhanite, is credited by some sources with introducing the so-called Hindu Arabic numerals from India to Europe. Historically, Jewish communities used letters of credit to transport large quantities of money without the risk of theft from at least classical times. This system was developed and put into force on an unprecedented scale by medieval Jewish merchants such as the Radhanites. If so, they may be counted among the precursors to the banks that arose during the late Middle Ages and early modern period. So we can see that these bankers that arose in the late modern period would have been from these groups because they had extensive knowledge of how to run this system and to do trading. Some scholars believe that the Radhanites may have played a role in the conversion of the Khazars to Judaism. So here we go, let's just prove my point. In addition, they may have helped establish Jewish communities at various points along their trade routes and were probably involved in the early Jewish settlements of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, China and India. Besides Ibn Khordadbeh and the Radhanites are mentioned by name only by a handful of sources. Ibn al-Faqih's early 10th century Kitab al-Buldan, Book of the Countries, mentions them, but much of Ibn al-Faqih's information was derived from Ibn Khordadbeh's work. Sefer ha-Dinim, a Hebrew account of the travels of Yehuda ben Meir of Mainz, named Przemysl and Kiev as trading sites along the Radhanite route. In early 12th century, a French Jewish trader named Yitzhak Dobello wrote that he travelled with Radhanite merchants to Poland. The fall of the Tang dynasty of China in 908 and the destruction of the Khazar Khaganates some 60 years later led to widespread chaos in Inner Eurasia. the Caucasus and China. Trade routes became unstable and unsafe, a situation exacerbated by Turkic invasions of Persia and the Middle East. And the Silk Road largely collapsed for centuries. This period saw the rise of mercantile Italian-style states, especially Genoa, Venice, Pisa, and Amalfi, who viewed the Radhanites as unwanted competitors. The economy of Europe was profoundly affected by the disappearance of the Radhanites. For example, documentary evidence indicates that many spices in regular use during the early Middle Ages completely disappeared from European tables. In the 10th century, Jews had previously in the large parts of Western Europe enjoyed a virtual monopoly on the spice trade. Some have speculated that a collection of 11th century Jewish scrolls discovered in a cave in Afghanistan, Samangan province in 2011 may be a leftover of the Radhanites who had mostly disappeared by the 12th century. So, here it says, opinions are divided as to who the Khazars were. The Khazars emerged from the Scythian and Agathiaci. The Scythians had first appeared on the fringes of the Assyrian Empire in Armenia, Azerbaijan, in areas to which Israelites had been exiled. The Agathiaci were also known as Akatsiri and definitely gave rise to the leading element among the Khazars. Khazars first appeared as allies of Byzantium, the Eastern Romans against the Persians. In the beginning, the Khazars controlled areas north and south of the Caucasus. They were allied with the Byzantines against the Arabs. The Arabs drove them northward. One of the major centers of the Khazars was the mouth of the Volga. This had formerly been a center of Orenburg cultures that reflected Assyrian and Persian origins and used the Aramaic language. Orenburg culture foreshadows the Goths who preceded the Khazars. The Khazars were also influenced by the Scythians, who had been in the Don River region and from whom they in part derived. Khazars may be divided into four main groups: those that originated south of the Caucasus, such as from the Armenian Azerbaijan area, north of the Caucasus and associated with the Huns by the Don River and linked to the Agathiaci, and Scythians by the Volga River extended to Khwarezmia to the east. It's the origins of Ashkenazic Jews and Yiddish. Recently, the geographical origins of Ashkenazic Jews and their native language Yiddish were investigated to applying the geographic population structure to a cohort of exclusively Yiddish-speaking and multilingual AJs. GPS localized most AJs along major ancient trade routes in northeastern Turkey, adjacent to primeval villages with names that resemble the word Ashkenaz. These findings were compatible with the hypothesis of an Iranian-Turco-Slavic origin for the AJs and a Slavic origin for Yiddish, and at odds with the Rhineland hypothesis advocating a Levantine origin for the AJs and German origins for Yiddish. We discuss how these findings advance three ongoing debates concerning: 1. The historical meaning of the term Ashkenaz, the genetic structure of AJs and their geographical origin as identified from multiple studies employing both modern and ancient DNA and original ancient DNA analysis, and the development of Yiddish. We provide additional validation to the non-Levantine origin of AJs using ancient DNA from the Near East and the Levant. Due to the rising popularity of geolocalization tools to address questions of origin, we briefly discussed the advantages and limitations of popular tools with focus on GPS approach. Our results reinforce the non-Levantine origins of the AJs. So, the geographical origin of biblical Ashkenaz or Ashkenazic Jews and Yiddish are among the longest standing questions in history, genetics, and linguistics. Uncertainties concerning the meaning of Ashkenaz arose in the 11th century when the term shifted from a designation of the Iranian Scythians to become that of the Slavs and Germans, and finally of German Ashkenazic Jews in the 11th and 13th centuries. The first known discussion of the origin of German Jews and Yiddish surfaced in writing of the Hebrew grammarian Elia Baxter in the first half of the 16th century. It is well established that the history is also reflected in the DNA through relationships between genetics, geography, and language. Max Weinreich, the doyen of the field of modern Yiddish linguistics, has already emphasized the truism that the history of Yiddish mirrors the history of its speakers. These relationships prompted Das et al. To address the question of Yiddish origin by analyzing the genome of Yiddish-speaking AJs, multilingual AJs, and Sephardic Jews, using the geographical population structure, which localizes genomes to where they experienced the last major admixture event. GPS traced nearly all AJs to major ancient trade routes in northeastern Turkey, adjacent to 4 primeval villages whose names resemble Ashkenaz, Ishkenaz, or Eshkenaz, Ashenaz, and Ashutz. Elevated in light of the Rhineland and Irano-Turkic Slavic hypothesis, the findings supported the later, implying that Yiddish was created by Slavo-Iranian Jewish merchants plying the Silk Roads. We discussed these findings from historical, genetic, and linguistic perspectives and calculate the genetic similarities of AJs and the Middle Eastern population to ancient genomes of the Anatolia, Iranian, and the Levant. We lastly review briefly the advantages and limitations of biolocalization tools and their application in genetic research. The historical meaning of Ashkenaz is one of the most disputed biblical place names. It appears in the Hebrew Bible as the name of one of Noah's descendants in Genesis 10:3, and as a reference to the kingdom of Ashkenaz, prophesied to be called together with Ararat and Minai to wage war against Babylon in Jeremiah 51. In addition to tracing AJs to the ancient Iranian lands of Ashkenaz and uncovering the villages whose names may be derived from Ashkenaz, the partial Iranian origin of AJs inferred by Das et al. Was further supported by the genetic similarity of AJs to Sephardic Mountain Jews and Iranian Jews, as well as their similarity to Near Eastern populations and simulated native Turkish and Caucasus populations. There are good grounds, therefore, for inferring that Jews who considered themselves Ashkenazic adopted this name and spoke of their lands as Ashkenaz, since they perceived themselves as of Iranian origin. That we find varied evidence of the knowledge of Iranian language among Moroccan and Andalusian Jews and Karaites prior to the 11th century is a compelling point of reference to assess the shared Iranian origins of Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews. Moreover, Iranian-speaking Jews in the Caucasus and the so-called Juhuris and Turkic-speaking Jews in the Crimea prior to World War II called themselves Ashkenazim. The Rhineland hypothesis cannot explain why a name that denotes Scythians and was associated with the Near East became associated with German lands in the 11th to 13th centuries. Abt Root suggested that Jewish immigrants to Europe transferred biblical names into the regions in which they settled. This is unconvincing. Biblical names were used as place names only when they had similar sounds. Not only German and Ashkenaz do not share similar sounds, but Germany was already named Germana or Germanja in the Iranian Babylonian Talmud completed in the 5th century AD, and not surprisingly as associated with Noah's grandson Gomer, Talmud Yoma. Name adoption also occurred when the exact place names were in doubt, as in the case of Safad, Spain. This is not the case here, as Abt Root 2 notes since Ashkenaz had a known and clear geographical affiliation, finally Germany was known to French scholars like the Radak as Armenia, after the Almani tribes, and term that was also adopted by Arab scholars. Had the French scholar Rashi interpreted Ashkenaz as Germany, it would have been known to the Radak, who used Rashi's symbols. Therefore, Wexler's proposal that Rashi used Ashkenaz in the meaning of Slavic, and that the term Ashkenaz assumed the solitary meaning German lands, only after the 11th century in Western Europe, as a result of the rise of Yiddish, is more reasonable. This is also supported by Das et al.'s major finding of the only known primeval villages whose name derived from the word Ashkenaz, located in the ancient lands of Ashkenaz. Our inference is therefore supported by historical linguistics and genetic evidence, which has more weight as a simple origin that can be easily explained than a more complex scenario that involves multiple translocations. The genetic structure of the Ashkenazi Jews were localized to modern-day Turkey and found to be genetically closest to Turkic, Southern Caucasian, and Iranian populations, suggesting a common origin from Iranian Ashkenaz lands. These findings were more compatible with an Iranian-Turco-Slavic origin for AJs and a Slavic origin for Yiddish than with the Rhineland hypothesis, which lacks historical, genetic, and linguistic support. The findings have also highlighted the strong social, cultural, and genetic bonds of Ashkenazic and Iranian Judaism and their shared Iranian origins. The hypothesis that Yiddish was a German origin ignores the mechanics of relaxification and linguistic process which produce Yiddish and other Old Jewish languages. The advantage of a geolocalization analysis is that it allows us to infer the geographical origin of the speakers of Yiddish, where they resided and with whom they intermingled, independently of historical controversies, which provides a data-driven view. On the question of geographical origins, this allows an objective view of potential linguistic influences on Yiddish, which exposes the dangers in adopting a linguistic creationism view in linguistics. Historical evidence in favor of an Iranian-Turco-Slavic origin for Yiddish is paramount. Jews played a major role on the Silk Road in the 9th and 11th century. In the mid-9th century, in roughly the same year, Jewish merchants in both Mainz and in Xi'an received special trading privileges from the Holy Roman Empire and the Tang Dynasty court. These roads linked Xi'an to Mainz and Andalusia and further to sub-Saharan Africa and across to the Arabian Peninsula and India, Pakistan. The Silk Road provided the motivation for Jewish settlement in Afro-Eurasia and in the 9th to 11th centuries, since the Jews played a dominant role on these routes as a neutral trading guild with no political agendas. Hence, the Jewish traders had contact with a wealth of languages in the areas that they traversed, which they brought back to their communities nestled in major trading hubs. The Central Eurasian Silk Roads were controlled by Iranian polities, which provided opportunities for Iranian-speaking Jews, who constituted the overwhelming bulk of the world's Jews from the time of Christ to the 11th century. And that's because they were taken away into Babylon, and when Media Persia allowed them to go back to Jerusalem and resettle, not all of them went back, and a lot of them stayed in Babylon. It should not come as a surprise to find that Yiddish and other Old Jewish languages contain components and rules from a large variety of languages, all of them spoken on the Silk Roads. In addition to language contacts, the Silk Roads also provided the motivation for widespread conversion to Judaism by populations eager to participate in the extremely lucrative trade, which had become a Jewish quasi-monopoly along the trade routes. These conversions are discussed in Jewish literature between the 6th and 11th centuries, both in Europe and Iraq. Yiddish and other Old Jewish languages were all created by the peripatetic merchants as secret languages that would isolate them from their customers and non-Jewish trading partners. The study of Yiddish Genesis thereby necessitates the study of the Old Jewish languages of the time period. There is also a quantifiable amount of Iranian and Turkic elements in Yiddish. The Babylonian Talmud, completed by the 6th century AD, is rich in Iranian legalistic and religious influences. From the Talmud, a large Iranian vocabulary has entered Hebrew and Judeo-Aramaic, and from there spread to Yiddish. This corpus has been known since the 1930s and is common knowledge to Talmud scholars. In the Khazar Empire, the Eurasian Jews playing the Silk Road became speakers of Slavic, an important language because of the trading activities of the Rus, pre-Ukrainians, with whom the Jews were undoubtedly allied on the routes linking Baghdad and Bavaria. This is evident by the existence of newly invented Hebraism inspired by Slavic patterns of discourse in Yiddish. We advocate for implementing a more evolutionary understanding in linguistics that includes giving more attention to the linguistic process that alter languages and acquiring more competence in other languages and histories. When studying the origin of Ashkenazic Jews and Yiddish, such knowledge should include the history of the Silk Roads and Irano-Turkish languages. So, conclusion, the meaning of the term Ashkenaz and the geographical origins of AJs and Yiddish are some of the longest standing questions in history, genetics and linguistics. In our previous work, we have identified ancient Ashkenaz, a region in northeastern Turkey that harbors 4 primeval villages whose names resemble Ashkenaz. Here we elaborate on the meaning of this term and argue that it acquired its modern meaning only after a critical mass of Ashkenazic Jews arrived in Germany. We show that all biolocalization analyzers have localized AJs to Turkey and that non-Levantine origins of AJs are supported by ancient genome analysis. Overall, these findings are compatible with the hypothesis of the Irano-Turco-Slavic origins of AJs and the Slavic origin for Yiddish and contradict the predictions of the Rhineland hypothesis that lacks historical, genetic and linguistic support. So we have the Scythians originating in this area north of the Black Sea, north of Persia and up towards Russia and the Slavs here. And the Scythians were in an alliance with the Parthian Empire around the time of King Herod, but they were also converts to Judaism, and it would seem that the Jewish merchants along the Silk Road routes converted them, and the incentive was to allow them to be a middleman between the Islamic and Christian and Chinese empires. So the epic story of how the Turks migrated from Central Asia to Turkey. How did modern Anatolia come to be occupied by Turks? The historical story may surprise you. Lovers of antiquity and the classical world know very well that Asia Minor, modern Turkey, was formerly inhabited by a variety of non-Turkic peoples. Most of these people spoke Indo-European languages and included the Hittites, Phrygians, and Luwians. Troy was probably a Luwian city. After the conquest of Alexander the Great, Asia Minor was mostly Hellenized and remained solidly Greek until the 11th century, with Armenians forming the majority of the eastern parts of the region as they had since antiquity. The second half of the first millennium CE, Turkic peoples were gradually streaming into most of Central Asia from the original homeland in the Altai Mountains of Western Mongolia. They gradually displaced or assimilated both the settled and nomadic Iranian-speaking people. But how did they get all the way to Turkey, which has the largest concentration of Turkic people today? In the 11th century, Turks began appearing at the edges of Asia Minor, Anatolia, which was then controlled by the Greeks. Many of the Turks were mercenaries in the employ of local Arab and Persian rulers to the east of the Byzantine Empire and Armenia. The dominant states in Asia Minor in 1037 and the Seleucid Empire, a Turkic state, was founded northeast of Iran in Central Asia and quickly overran much of Persia, Iraq, and the Levant. By 1060, the Seleucid Empire bordered Byzantine Asia Minor. It should be noted that the Turks were a minority ruling a Persian, Arab, and Kurdish majority. The main strategic threat to the Turks was the Fatimid Caliphate based in Egypt. The Fatimids were Ismailis, Shia, and ruled over Jerusalem and Mecca at the time, while the Turks upheld Sunni Islam. The Sunni Caliph in Baghdad was their puppet. By this time, the Caliph had ceased to exercise any political role, while the Seleucid sultans held the reign of power. As was the case of many empires, many problems arose due to the conflict between nomadic rulers and the sedentary population. Thus, many of the Turkic tribes under Seleucid rule actually posed a problem for the Seleucids, since they were restless and sometimes raided settled populations ruled by the Seleucids. As a result, many of the Turkic tribes and families were placed on frontiers of the Seleucid Empire, including on the frontier of the Byzantine Empire. Turkish raids into Asia Minor commenced, greatly annoying the Byzantines. In 1045, the Byzantines conquered Armenia. Their frontier was with the Seleucids was not particularly strong or pacified. As a result of the intermediate warfare there, additionally, many Armenians did not like the Byzantines and did not help them resist the Turkish raids. Eventually, by 1071, the Byzantines, exasperated at constant Turkish raids, decided to move a large army to their borders to eliminate the Turkish threat once and for all. Unfortunately, this was not a particularly good idea because their strength lay in manning border forts against lightly armed tribal warriors. By attempting to fight a pitched battle, they also risked total defeat. Furthermore, the Seleucid Turks did not want to antagonize the Byzantines. Their state apparatus was directed against Egypt. It was only tribes that were barely under central Seleucid control that were raiding the Byzantine. Romanus IV, Diogenes, the Byzantine emperor, created a previously non-existent threat for the Seleucids by moving some 40,000 troops to his eastern border, thus altering the Seleucid Sultan Arslan to the threat from Asia Minor. Thus, the Byzantines, by diverting the Turks' attention from Egypt, brought a Turkic army to Asia Minor from Persia and Central Asia. So we have this Mongolian steppe and the Altai Mountains up here north in Mongolia, near Russia, Kazakhstan, and China. And this is where the Turkic people originated from. So they occupied Central Asia and moved down into Iran and into Armenia and then down into Turkey through there, and they took control of the Ottoman Empire later on in their history. So it looks like a beautiful place. the Xinjiang terrain, 3 mountains and 2 basins. 3 mountains and 2 basins is the geographic feature of Xinjiang, with the Altai Mountains on the north boundary and the Kunlun Mountains on the south boundary, the Tian Shan Mountains in the middle, and the natural geographical divide line between Zhangga Basin and the Tarim Basin. So Xinjiang is divided into 2 parts, southern Xinjiang and northern Xinjiang. The Altai Mountains extended approximately 2,000 kilometers in southeast-northwest direction from the Gobi to the West Siberian Plain, through China, Mongolia, Russia, and Kazakhstan. The jagged mountain ridges divide their name from the Turkic-Mongolian Altan, meaning golden. The mountain system has 3 main subdivisions, the Altai proper and the Mongolian and Gobi Altai. A peak in the Altai proper, Beluka, at an elevation of 4,506 meters, is the range's highest point. In the past, these mountains were so remote. Wow, I'd like to go there. In Chinese mythology, Kulan Mountain, also called Kunlana Langsu, is highly appreciated as a holy mountain where Jiwanmu, the highest ranked goddess of Taoists, live. Kunlun Mountain starts at the eastern Pamir Plateau. Ottomans, Turkic ancestry, Islamic heritage, and dynastic origins with the release of... So the birthplace of the Turks. So where did the Turkic people originate from and what brought them to Anatolia? The birthplace of the Turks is the Altai Mountains in Central Asia. They originated from the tribal kingdom of Tukui on the Orkhon River, south of Lake Baikal, and north of the Gobi Desert in present-day Outer Mongolia. The Turkic people were nomadic, they were skilled horsemen and were grouped into many different tribes and clans, all trying to live off the harsh lands of the steppe. A slow migration out of Central Asia began in the 6th century, accelerating from the 9th century onwards. The initial cause of the migration was the pressure exerted by a growing population on a fragile pastoral economy. This was aggravated by climate change and further exacerbated by fears of Mongol oppression. The Oghuz Turks, among those who migrated westward during the 8th century, were the Oghuz Turks. They travelled from the Altai Mountains through the Siberian steppes and settled around Bukhara. It was from here the westward Turkic migrations into Western Asia and Eastern Europe occurred during the 9th and 12th centuries. The Oghuz are often referred to as the Western Turks. This is because they migrated west from the other Turkic peoples and generally settled west in the Caspian Sea. There were a loosely linked group of nomadic tribes. The Kayai tribe, one such tribe was the Kayai tribe, and it was from the Kayai tribe that the Ottomans are descended. Kayai means the one who has power and might. Indeed, the Ottomans were to become the vast embodiment of this quality, for they were to establish one of the most powerful and mightiest empires in the history of the world. As true Oghuz Turks, their quest to head west would lead them to conquer territories stretching to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. It is interesting to observe that this fascination with all things Western continues in modern Turkey. However, the more recent interest in our Eastern ancestry and the Central Asian roots of Turkic people can never be forgotten. So in Genesis 10 verse 2, we have the sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madian, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. So we have Magog here, and Magog was the grandson of Noah via his son Japheth. And it says in Revelation 20, and when the 1,000 years were expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison and shall go out to deceive the nations which are the 4 quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together in battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And I believe it's Gog, son of Magog. In Ezekiel 38, verse 1 to 2, it says, Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog and the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. So Meshech, in the Bible, Meshech or Moshech, is named as the son of Japheth in Genesis. Historical interpretations, Meshech is mentioned along with Tubal and Rosh in certain translations as principalities of Gog, prince of Magog, in Ezekiel 38, and is considered a Japhite tribe identified by Flavius Josephus with the Cappadocian Moshechini or Mushkai, also associated with the Phrygians or Burgits and their capital Mazaka. So, in addition, Georgians have traditions that they and other Caucasus peoples such as Armenians share descent from Meshech, Tubal, and Togarmah. So apparently in the Bible, Japheth is ascribed 7 sons: Gomer, Magog, Tiras, Javan, Meshech, Tubal, and Madai. According to Josephus in Antiquity of the Jews, Japheth, the sons of Noah, had 7 sons. Japheth, the son of Noah, had 7 sons. They inhabited, that beginning at the mountains Taurus and Amanus, they proceeded along Asia as far as River Tanais, the River Don, and along Europe to Cadiz, and settling themselves on lands which they light upon which none had inhabited before, they called the nations by their own names. Josephus subsequently detailed the nations supposed to have descended from the 7 sons of Japheth. The Book of Jasher, published by Talmudic rabbis in the 17th century, provides some of the names of Japheth's grandchildren not found in the Bible and provided a much more detailed genealogy. So the origins of the Turkic people has been a topic of much discussion. Recent linguistic, genetic, and archaeological evidence suggests that the earliest Turkic peoples descended from agricultural communities in northeastern China and wider northeast Asia, who moved westward into Mongolia in the late 3rd millennium BC, and they adopted a pastoral life. So the most notable Turkic-speaking ethnic groups include Turkish people, Azerbaijanians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Turkmens, Kyrgyz, Uyghur people. The first known mention of the term Turk, Old Turkic, applied to only one Turkic group named Gök Turks, who were also mentioned in Turag Torok in the 6th century Kuris Tolgoi inscription, most likely not later than 587 AD. Altai's indigenous peoples, what's in a name? Russia officially recognizes 4 small-numbered peoples of the North Siberia and Far East. Roughly 23% of almost 147 million people living in Russia as of 2021 are not ethnically Russian. The government classifies indigenous peoples living in the country in 3 ways: small-numbered peoples, less than 50,000 individuals, indigenous peoples living in North Siberia and Far East, and peoples living in Western Russia. Altai Republic, total population of 221,000 as of 2021, has 69,000 indigenous Altians. All of these native peoples historically spoke Altian, a language now struggling to survive, especially its minority dialects. Similarly, the name of another northern Altai people, the Kumandin, also has its origins in Turkish word ku. 2,600 Kumandan people live in southwestern Siberia, most of them in Altai Krai, but quite a few in the Republic. Prior to the Russian Revolution in 1917, they were known as the Black Tatars, another reference to the Black Taiga. Under Russian influence, the Kumandin referred to themselves as Tatar Kizhi. Of the Altai peoples, the 1,600 Tubala represent the largest northern Altai population in Altai Republic. They self-identify using a number of names in the past until their Sioux were consolidated into single geographic groups and common name arose. They call themselves the Yishkizhi, which translate to people of the Taiga. Old Russian documents refer to the Tubala as Black Taigi Tatars. And what's interesting is this name Tubala is very close to the name Tubal of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. So in Genesis 10:2-5, the sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. Sons of Javan were Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanium. From these coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, to their nations. Josephus refers to Magog, son of Japheth, as progenitor of the Scythians, or people north of the Black Sea. According to him, the Greeks called Scythia Magogia, an alternate identification derived from an exclamation of the order in which tribal names are listed in Ezekiel 38 would place Magog between Cappadocia and Media. According to Rabbi Shlomo Gans Fried, the 19th century, Magog refers to the Mongols. He cites an Arab writer who refers to the Great Wall of China with the name Magog. So they seem to be the oldest historical reference to who Magog were. Jordanes Getica mentions Magog as ancestors of the Goths, as does the Historia Britannium, but Isidore of Seville asserts that the identification was popular because of similarity of the last syllable. Johannes Magus stated that Magog migrated to Scandinavia 88 years after the flood, and that his 5 sons were Suno, ancestor of the Swedes, Geth or Getha or Gog, ancestor of the Goths, Ubo, who later ruled Swedes and built Old Uppsala, Thor, and German. Magus' accounts became accepted at the Swedish court for a long time, and even caused dynastic numerals of the Swedish monarchs to be renumbered accordingly. Queen Christina of Sweden reckoned herself as the number 249 in a list of kings going back to Magog. Magnus also influenced several later historians such as Daniel Justinianus, who derived roots of the Finns from Magog. According to several medieval Irish chronicles, the Irish race are composite, including descendants of Japheth and Magog from Scythia. Bath Mac Magog, Job Hath, and Fath Octa are the 3 sons of Magog: Phenis, Phased, Patholon, Nemed, the Furbolg, and Tutha Didanan, and the Milesians are among Magog's descendants. There is also a medieval Hungarian legend that says the Huns, as well as the Magyars, are descended from the twin brothers named Hunor and Magor, respectively, who lived by the Sea of Azov in the years after the flood and took wives from the Alans. The version of this legend is in the 14th century Chronicon Pictum, equates this major Magor with Magog, son of Japheth. So it seems to be the more ancient versions put them as Scythia. And even the Hungarian version, the Huns come from the Scythians also, and so it seems to be that these Scythian tribes migrated east into these east and west. Scythians were nomadic pastoralists and formidable warriors. Scythians is a term used to denote a diverse and culturally related group of the nomads who occupy a large swathe of grasslands or steppes that stretched from north of the Black Sea all the way to China, sometimes also known as Saka or Scyths. The name Scythian was coined by the ancient Greeks. Scythian culture flourished on these steppes about 800 BC to about AD 300. Adrian Mayer, a folklorist and historian at Stratford University and the author of The Amazons, Lives and Legends of Warrior Women Across the Ancient World, told Live Science the Scythians were known to many ancient civilizations, she said, including the ancient Greeks, Persians, Romans, and Chinese. and they preferred the art of archery on horseback. Even without the use of stirrups or saddles, they had a reputation of ferocity in battle and were masters of hit-and-run battle tactics. There is much debate about the origins of the Scythians. According to the 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus, Scythians originally inhabited Asia, but were pushed west by a hostile tribe. They eventually reached the Black Sea region and eastern outskirts of Europe, where they in turn pushed out the existing inhabitants. By contrast, the Greek writer Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, claimed the Scythians moved north into the steppe region from south, possibly from the modern area of Armenia, or even farther south along the western border with India. In a different and far more fanciful origin story, Herodotus tells how the Scythians were the descendants of a mighty hero, Heracles, and a creature who was half woman and half snake. In the story of Heracles encountered the creature while traveling in the land east of Greece. After stealing Heracles' horse, the creature demanded that if he wanted them back, he would have to stay and mate with her. The union produced 3 sons, one of whom was named Scythus, who became the ancestor of the Scythian nobility. Modern historians, however, have used archaeological and genetic evidence to reconstruct the Scythian origins. It appears that we call Scythian culture emerged more than 2,500 years ago as a combination of Siberian, East Asia, and Yamnaya Eurasian groups. Maya Lord Live Science, just as the region of ancient Scythia had many different languages, great ethnic diversity is also found in Scythian ancestry, especially in the maternal line. All the studies so far confirm that Scythians were not a single homogeneous group, although genetic studies are revealing a great deal about the makeup of the diverse peoples of the land once known as Scythia. The full story is not yet known and is still debated, Maya noted. The open grassland of the steppes, an environment of vast plains and low-rolling hills, was beneficial to pastoralism, and for millennia, human populations on the landscape tended large herds of livestock. Scythians were no exception. They tended herds of cattle, horses, according to Herodotus, and most people roamed the steppes rather than settling down in permanent habitations. According to the World History Encyclopedia, the Scythians moved about the landscape in wagons driven by oxen. Some of these wagons were large and elaborate with multiple rooms. When multiple wagons travelled together, the conglomeration resembled a city or large settlement. The Scythians were organized into tribes that were not united politically, but shared a common language, culture, style, dress, and art style. During certain periods, such as times of war or celebration or ritual undertakings, different tribes came together from larger political units or confederations. It is unclear whether Scythian society had sharp social divisions, such as hereditary elites, but in many respects they appear to have been relatively egalitarian, Maya said, especially with regard to gender roles. The historical and archaeological records indicates that Scythian women enjoyed considerable autonomy and privilege that would not be rivaled until modern times. According to the World History Encyclopedia, for example, many Scythian women served alongside men as mounted horse archers and could hold leadership roles in Scythian society. Moreover, numerous Scythian burials show that women were often interred with as much elaborate offerings as men. In 2019, for instance, the burial containing 4 women was found that contained offerings typically reserved for men, including weapons and gold. Herodotus mentioned the existence of Scythian kings, using the term royal Scythians to designate this group. He indicated that they were a separate tribe and lived in what is now southern part of Ukraine, immediately north of the ancient Greek towns that clustered around the Black Sea. Herodotus indicated that they wielded considerable political and military power, and they were a hereditary elite, but it's unclear what their relation to the other Scythian tribes. When a royal Scythian died, a large grave consisting of a great 4-cornered pit and a ground was prepared, and the individual's body was placed inside, according to Herodotus. The individual was buried with his concubines, his cupbearer, his cook, his groom, his squire, and his messenger. besides horses and first fruits of all else, and golden cups. Archaeologists have excavated some of these high-status tombs, which are called kurgans. One of these, found in southern Siberia, dates from 2,800 years ago and was wider than the length of a football field. Life Science previously reported it contained the burial of a man and woman and was filled with gold jewelry, weapons, richly decorated cups. Somewhere traces of drugs like opium and other grave goods. Several classical writers mention the Scythians' distinctive dress, describing the men as wearing peaked caps, colourful tunics, and most characteristically long trousers that reached down to the ankles. The Scythians were fond of elaborate design, intricate embroidery, and bold colours. Men and women wore boots that were like the Scythian attire in general, colourful and emblazoned with many designs and patterns. One of these, a woman's boot, was found in the Altai Mountains in Central Asia and dates around 2,300 years ago. Reported the Scythians were famous for their practice of tattooing designs of real and mythical animals, many rendered in highly stylized patterns, were especially prominent on arms and legs. According to the Siberian Times, the mummy of a young woman dubbed the Ukok Princess was found in 1993. She displayed a series of elaborate tattoos, including depictions of a deer, a panther, and a griffin. Other tattooed mummies have been found throughout ancient Scythian region. Scythians were especially renowned for their skills as mounted archers. Scythian males and females mounted archers were admired and feared by Greeks, Romans, Persians, and Chinese, whose great wall was built to defend against them, Maya said. Scythians' primary weapon was the composite bow, which was made of wood, horn, and sinew. The military skill was recognized by the many civilizations around them, and Scythian warriors frequently served as mercenaries in the foreign armies, such as with the Persian Empire and the forces of the Greco-Persian king Mithridates VI. So we can see that the Scythians were part of these Turkic tribes in the Altai Mountains. And we look across all of Central Asia, there's a diversity of different looks, and some have a more Asian look, and as the Mongols, and then as we get further to the western borders of the Central Asia, they become more European looking, and it's just a mixture. They almost look native Indian, not North American Indian, but they're definitely Asian looking, although the Scythian mummies were quite fair with red hair. And I think that these Turkic groups blended in together. So this article states that study says Japanese, Korean, and Turkish language all emerged from common ancestors in northeast China. An international study concludes that the Trans-Eurasian or Altic language family emerged from farmers in West Liao Valley and spread across Asia. The link between the 5 groups in the family has been hotly contested, but researchers say there is archaeological and genetic evidence to support the theory. Modern language ranging from Japanese and Korean to Turkish and Mongolian may share a common ancestor from ancient China around 9,000 years ago, according to a new study. An international team of researchers said languages from Trans-Eurasian family, also known as Altic, could be traced back to early millet farmers in the Liao Valley in what is now northeast China, and is spread driven by agriculture. The origins and degree to which the 5 groups that make up the Trans-Eurasian family are related has long been an area of contention among scholars, but the team said that recent studies have shown a reliable core of evidence supporting the theory that they emerged from a common ancestor. Based on genetic and archaeological evidence, as well as linguistic analysis, the researchers said the languages spread north and west to Siberia and the steppes, and east to Korea and Japan as farmers moved across Northeast Asia. A conclusion that challenges the traditional pastoral hypothesis, which proposed the dispersal was led by nomads as they migrated away from the eastern steppes. Sinitic language, which includes modern forms of Chinese such as Mandarin and Cantonese, have a different origin. Accepting that the roots of one's language and, to an extent, one's culture lie beyond present national boundaries can require kind of reorientation of identity, and this is not always an easy step for people to take. Lead author and comparative linguist Martine Roberts said, "But the science of human history shows us that the history of all languages, cultures, and peoples is one of extended interaction and mixture." The leader of the Archaeolinguistic research group at the Max Planck Institute for Science of Human History in Germany said, "The researchers from Britain, China, and the Czech Republic, France, Germany, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, Russia, and the Netherlands and the United States published their findings in the journal Nature last Wednesday. The linguistic relatedness of the Trans-Eurasian language, also known as Altaic, is amongst the most disputed issue in linguistic prehistory," the team said, referring to the language family that is spread all across Eurasia from Japan, Korea, and Siberia in the east to Turkey in the west. The question of whether these 5 groups, Japonic, Koreanic, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic, descend from a single common ancestor, has been the topic of a long-standing debate between supporters of inheritance and borrowing. A key problem is the relationship between linguistic dispersal, agricultural expansion, and population movements. The study concluded that Trans-Eurasian languages share a common ancestry which has been masked by extensive cultural interaction since the Bronze Age. The researchers said a dataset representing more than 250 vocabulary concepts in 98 languages showed the roots of the language family reaching back 9,181 years to millet farmers living in the region of the West Lao River. They said a small core of inherited words relating to land cultivation such as field, sow, plant, and grow, as well as mentions of millet but not rice or other crops, supported their farming hypothesis. Meanwhile, the team's archaeological analysis focused on West Laos Basin, where the farming of broomcorn millet standing about 9,000 years ago. They identified a cluster of Neolithic cultures in the river basin from which 2 millet farming cultures emerged, the Korean Chulman branch and a branch of cultures covering the Amur, Primor, and Liaodong areas. A further analysis found a relationship between Bronze Age sites in the West Liao area and Mumin sites in Korea and Yayoi sites in Japan, showing that rice and wheat farming had been introduced to the Liaodong Shandong area before spreading to Korean peninsula in the early Bronze Age, and from there to Japan around 3,000 years ago. Meanwhile, the genetic analysis identified a common genetic component called Amur-like ancestry among all speakers of Trans-Eurasian languages, and reported a collection of genetic genomes from Korea, the Ryukyu Island, and early cereal farmers in Japan. By advancing new evidence from the ancient DNA, our research thus confirms recent findings that Japanese, and Korean populations have West Liao River ancestry, whereas it contradicts previous claims that there is no genetic correlation to the Trans-Eurasian language family, the researchers said. So the Altaic language is related to the Altai Mountains, denoting or belonging to phylum or superfamily of languages which includes the Turkic, Mongolian, Tungusic, and Manchu languages. They are characterized by agglutration and vowel harmony. And although it says that the Mandarin language and the Chinese from the south are not related, it does say that the Manchu Chinese are part of this group, a member of people originally living in Manchuria, who formed the last imperial dynasty of China from 1644 to 1912. The Tongistic language of the Manchu is still spoken by a few thousand people in Xinjiang, though most Manchus now speak Chinese. So there's this link here between the Central Asians, and as I said, there's a diversity in looks in the Central Asians. We go anywhere from Turkey, which have a more Middle Eastern look, the Uyghurs in Central Asia, right through to the Manchurian Chinese, the Mongolians, and the Scythians. And these people are all related, and it appears that these people are the descendants of Magog, or the son of Japheth. So we have the old legend of the two giants of Gog and Magog also. But what does that mean for us? That means that according to Revelation 20, the dragon is going to bring Gog and Magog against the remaining saints, or the people who are camped in their Sukkot, in their tents, the camp of the saints. And if we are in this time of the little season of Satan, then it'll be people from these ancient groups that are used to come against the last remaining people and believers in the true Hebrew faith. So we have these Jews of the Silk Road merchants, and they are converting the Scythian people to, or the Ashkenazim, to Judaism and forming an allegiance. And we could see that the allegiance would have involved protection, because the Scythian people were very good mercenaries, and it would have been a win-win situation for both of them, because they could both make money being middlemen in the Islamic and Christian nations of East and West. And just want to make a point too that the Russians are not all from these Turkic people. They would be a mixture of Turkic people, but they're also the northern Russians. The history of Russia begins with the histories of the East Slavs. The traditional state date of specifically Russian history is establishment of the Rus estate in the north in 862 by the Varangians. Staraya Ladoga, or Novgorod, became the first major cities of the new union of immigrants from Scandinavia with the Slavs and Finns. So in 882, Prince Oleg of Novgorod seized Kiev, thereby uniting the northern and southern lands and eastern Slavs under one authority. So the northern Russians are of Scandinavian descent. The southern Russians and the Ukrainians are of more of a Scythian, Turkic descent, and a mixture. And we go across to the east, and we have the Mongolians. I mean, Russia's a huge country, so, you know, when we get these Christian prophecies saying that China and Russia will come against Israel, well, it's possible the way things are going politically, but, you know, Russia itself is not of the Scythian descent entirely. It's originally from the Scandinavian people up north, and the Slavs and the Finns. So when we're looking at this Gog Magog prophecy, I believe we're specifically talking about the people of the Turkic background. And that is the Central Asian people, possibly the Chinese people, and the Turkish people. The Scythian Ashkenazi conversions to Judaism, they tie in with the dragon because, and this is where the link between Gog Magog and the dragon comes from. It comes from the Edomite converts to Judaism in the in the time of the Maccabees, the Herod kings and the Edomite people, and it comes from the conversion of the Scythians or the Turkic people to Judaism, or what we know as Babylonian Talmudism, which was prevalent in the temple at the time of the apostles and Jesus. So we have this bastardization, if you want to use that word, of the faith going way back to Babylon, and a mixture of the southern kingdom people with the Edomite people, and the Edomite people mixing with the Turkic Scythians. And so this is what I believe the Bible is telling us, is that we have this dragon which returns at the end of time out of the pit, and it brings these people from the Gog Magog peoples in an alliance. And who has the biggest alliance with the dragon bankers of London? And I'll just read from this blog. I'm not sure of their background and agenda, but communism, also known as Rothschildism, or more bluntly, robbery. And we have communism is a monopoly over everything, including thought, enforced by the state. The state is a front for the Illuminati Jewish central bankers who own its debt. Anything that increases state power is communist. World government will take this to the next level. This is not war already a revolutionary function? War, the commune, 1870, since that time every war was a giant step towards communism. And this is by Henry Mackau, PhD. Wow, medicine is the keystone of the arch of socialism, Vladimir Lenin. So it says here, thus began the modus operandi of the Rothschild, fabricating chaos and bilking the chaos, whatever it may be, for all the money he can. The best way to destroy a free open market capitalist system was to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of the citizens. And isn't that what we're experiencing today with this pandemic that we've all had to endure? Now our inflation is going through the roof and food is becoming increasingly unavailable and expensive. Fuel is getting beyond most people's ability to buy or at will. And this is all deliberately contrived. Rothschilds formed the Soviet Union by financing Vladimir Lenin in the orchestrated 1917 bloody murder of Tsar Nicholas II and his entire family in Russia. Rothschilds are the originators of mafia. They are unelected, controlling thugs who have cheated, murdered, bribed, fear-mongered their way to public control. And this is the people of the world have now begun to unravel this web of deceit and are taking action. So we have the NYC and London bankers who financed the Bolshevik Revolution. Who financed Lenin and Trotsky? The top communist leaders have never been as hostile to their counterparts in the West as the rhetoric suggests. They are quite friendly to the world's leading financiers and have worked closely with them when it suits their purpose. As we shall see in the following section, the Bolshevik Revolution actually was financed by wealthy financiers in London and New York. Lenin and Trotsky were on the closest of terms with the money interests both before and after the revolution. Those hidden liaisons have continued to this day and occasionally pop to the surface when we discover a David Rockefeller holding confidential meetings with a Mikhail Gorbachev in the absence of government sponsorship or diplomatic purpose. So this amazing story begins with the war between Russia and Japan in 1904. Jacob Schiff, who was head of the New York investment firm Kuhn, Loeb and Company, had raised the capital for large war loans to Japan. It was due to this funding that the Japanese were able to launch a stunning attack against the Russians at Port Arthur, and the following year to virtually decimate the Russian fleet. In 1905, the Mikado awarded Jacob Schiff a medal, the Second Order of the Treasure of Japan, in recognition of his important role in that campaign. So we have Jacob Schiff financing the war and the communists to take over Russia. So nor was this phenomenon confined to the United States. Trotsky, in his book My Life, tells of a British financier who in 1907 gave him a large loan to be repaid after the overthrow of the Tsar. Arsene de Gulevich, who witnessed the Bolshevik Revolution firsthand, has identified both the name of the financier and the amount of the loan. In private interviews, he said, "I have been told that over 21 million rubles were sent by Lord Alfred Milner in financing the Russian Revolution." The financier just mentioned was by no means alone among the British to support the Russian Revolution with large financial donations. Another name specifically mentioned by de Gulevich was that of Sir George Buchanan, the British ambassador to Russia at the time. So here we have Rothschilds in China, right? Jacob Schiff, the Rothschild lieutenant who funded Mao and the Communist Revolution and the Japanese invasion of China. We created communism. We have these Asian countries that all have a dragon as their symbol, and they're all part of the communist Asian belt. And currently, after the fall of the Soviet Union, these are the countries left in the world that are still communist. Have North Korea, China, Laos, Cuba, Vietnam. And communism's just terrorism. I remember going on a trek in Nepal, and the Maoist groups that were coming into the villages there and terrorizing the families and the people who were just wanting to live their lives and be farmers. And, you know, this is funded by these globalist banks. Here we have a blog, Rothschild Investment Group partners with the Vatican to rebrand communism as inclusive capitalism. So there you have it, the world's wealthiest banking dynasty, the Rothschilds, openly promoting world communism, but rest assured, it won't be their enormous wealth that is redistributed. It will be yours. For those who understand real history, elite Jewish bankers have been funding communism now for over 150 years. Jacob Schiff personally financed the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, and the Rothschilds providing funding to Karl Marx to write his Communist Manifesto. And as we see in that slight insight into the Rothschild archives from the book I showed in the last video, that Bruno Bauer, the teacher of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, was on a train with two Rothschild agents to London. So this whole philosophic group of the 19th century were all part of this agenda. Revelation tells us that the dragon gives power to the beasts. And so it's not only this communist Gog Magog, as I believe communism is Gog Magog, as everyone behind communism were of Ashkenazic Jewish origin, which links back to the Turkic group of people who then link back to the son of Japheth in the Bible, who was the father of Magog. But it's also these two beasts that have ruled over the people of the earth for however long they've been allowed to rule. And the dragon gives both of them their power. So the beast of the sea, which I believe is the Holy Roman Empire, or the extension of the Roman Empire. The beast of the earth, which I believe is the Ottoman Empire. And the dragon, who was the Edomite, red kingdom of Herod, and the Idumean converts to the southern kingdom of Judah.
All these countries in the empire used to use the sterling currency, and the City of London was kind of the financier of this zone, not just inside the sterling zone, but outside the sterling zone as well.
As Britain's empire declined, so too did the City of London. With the decline of empire, British commercial interests across the globe were under threat. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal.
A new Middle East crisis arises as President Nasser of Egypt tells a wildly cheering crowd in Alexandria that Egypt has seized the internationally owned Suez Canal.
As financiers withdrew their money from Britain, the value of the pound decreased. To protect the value of the pound, Britain limited the bank's overseas lending.
They were not able to invest abroad. And obviously they were unhappy, and we don't know exactly the context, but it's very clear that the banks or their representative made a representation to the Bank of England, which in itself was dominated by representatives from the banking industry. It seems that they have reached an agreement which was never written, that if the banks intermediated between two non-residents in a foreign currency, in that case the dollar, that this particular intermediation, this particular deal will not be considered by the Bank of England under its own jurisdiction.
The banks began to create a market for dollars in London, called the London Eurodollar market. To differentiate these euro market activities from their domestic banking activities, banks kept two sets of accounts. The Bank of England, the UK regulator, declared that the London Euro market accounts were not in London. They were elsewhere, and therefore it had no responsibility for regulating them.
It's about providing a legal space in which you pretend activity is taking place. And the importance of that is that you pretend it's not taking place in the economy where it really is taking place. So you're taking activity from the place where it's regulated and taxed and pretending that it's happening elsewhere. Now where doesn't really matter, it's just elsewhere.
When American banks realized that London offered the ability to avoid US regulations, they moved their international operations to the city. Around the same time as American banks were moving their international operations to London, another new kind of financial space began to emerge, far away from London, in Britain's overseas jurisdictions, the last remnants of empire.
Back in the 60s, the Cayman Islands was a complete backwater. The stories go that mosquitoes were so thick in the air, sometimes they were enough to suffocate cows. That's a legend that you hear about the Cayman Islands. I don't know how true it was, but there was nothing happening there.
Accountants and lawyers from London arrived in the Cayman Islands and other British dependencies and began to draft a set of financial secrecy laws and regulations. Because these jurisdictions' main selling point was secrecy, they were called secrecy jurisdictions.
What the Cayman Islands was doing was straightforwardly illegal activity. Drugs money was coming in huge quantities, tax evasion, whatever you wanted, you could have it.
The British Empire had sunk, leaving hardly a trace behind. But the City of London adapted and survived. The City of London, London's financial district, is a peculiar place. It has been called a city within a city, a state within a state. It is run by an organisation called the City of London Corporation, a private company that performs all the functions of a local council with a private police force and private courts.
Those of you who aren't from the UK, some of you even who are, might not be aware just how weird a thing the little city of London is within the big London. The City of London is a separate entity to the wider London, and it has its own head, the Lord Mayor, who's distinct from the Mayor, who runs the rest of London.
Every November, the city stages the Lord Mayor's Show, the world's oldest civic procession.
The City of London has long had this curious legal status because back in 1066, when William the Conqueror came over, the city was one of the only portions of England that he failed to conquer, and he struck a deal with the city in 1067 that allowed them to continue functioning.
To this day, the City of London is exempt from numerous laws that govern the rest of Britain. Its political system derives from the Middle Ages. The city's electorate is dominated not by its residents, but by the private businesses operating within the city. Its Lord Mayor is selected by the heads of medieval guilds.
They have a representative in the House of Commons called the Remembrancer. Apart from the clerks of the court of the House of Commons, he's the only unelected person there.
All other lobbyists have to stop, in the lobby. They're not allowed past the lobby.
The City of London has a permanent representative in the House of Commons, whose role is to report back to the City of London Corporation and to lobby Parliament on behalf of the city.
The Corporation of London, clearly, it's a unique and interesting phenomenon that should have attracted many political scientists, political economists and economists. But I don't know of anyone who has studied systematically the Corporation of London and its impact on policy or economic policy. So we can only surmise. Some people assume or surmise that the Corporation of London is extremely powerful and is able in one way or another to shape British policy, particularly in financial matters.
Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister after the Second World War, had something to say about the City of London Corporation.
He did, yeah. So over and over again, we have seen that there is in this country another power than that which has its seat at Westminster. The City of London, a convenient term for a collection of financial interests, is able to assert itself against the government of the country. Those who control money can pursue a policy at home and abroad, contrary to that which has been decided by the people.
At the heart of the City of London stands the Bank of England. The Bank of England is not just a central bank, it is also a financial regulator. At the demise of empire, the Bank of England used this regulatory authority to help attract the world's banks to London. There are more banks in London than in any other financial centre.
In Britain, nobody goes to jail. No bankers go to jail. They generally don't. They are a protected species. And that is part of the offshore business model of the UK, is to say, we will protect you, we will bring your money here, we will look after you. We're not going to put you in prison, we'll let you do what you want.
Light touch regulation was one way of attracting business to London. Another was secrecy. From the 1960s onwards, City of London institutions began to establish offshore branches in former outposts of the British Empire. Their aim was to create offshore centres with strong secrecy legislation in order to attract capital from across the globe.
Swiss banking secrecy is the most famous, the most well-known. You put your money in a Swiss bank and they promise not to tell anybody, and that's one kind of secrecy. But another kind of secrecy, which is very British, is the trust. And the trust is a very slippery, complicated and devious mechanism. Trusts emerged, the legend has it, from the time of the Crusades, when the knights would go off and fight in foreign lands, and they would leave their assets in the care of trusted stewards.
What trusts do ultimately is they play with the concept of ownership. Ownership is not such a simple thing. So The settlor, the knight in this case, would hand over the assets to someone who these days would be called a trustee. It's often a lawyer. Legally, you are separated from those assets. They're not yours anymore. There's a barrier. You can't be taxed on them. Nobody's going to find anything about your connection to these assets.
In Britain's offshore jurisdictions, no qualifications are necessary to be a trustee. Anyone can set up a trust and act as a trustee. There is no registry of trusts. There are no bodies to certify that a trust has been set up.
The only persons who know about the creation of this agreement are the trustee and the settlor. There's no obligation to register it. There is no financial reporting obligation of trusts. They're not required to put annual statements onto account anywhere. So actually trusts are, to all intents and purposes, invisible arrangements.
Economist John Christensen was an economic advisor to the secrecy jurisdiction of Jersey for 10 years.
We're not talking about a few million. We're talking now about trillions. Trillions of dollars of capital, which apparently belong to nobody. For tax purposes and for other purposes, they belong to nobody. Everything, works of arts, gold bullion, racehorses, cars, real estate, not just financial assets, but a whole load of non-financial assets belong to these trusts, sitting there belonging to nobody. Now think that one through, because we are talking about maybe as much as $50 trillion of assets sitting offshore behind these instruments. The trust lies at the core of the British secrecy model. They don't use banking secrecy. The Swiss use banking secrecy. The British, of course, are only too willing to kill off banking secrecy because they will then capture a larger market share. That's why the Brits are doing this.
Trusts are the basic building block of Anglo-Saxon secrecy, and they form the basis from which complex offshore structures are created. Every secrecy jurisdiction offers a specific set of services, from trusts to shell companies to secret bank accounts and nominee directors. The combination of these services into complex structures, spanning multiple jurisdictions, enables the creation of secrecy structures that are almost impossible to penetrate.
An offshore structure will often have a trust kind of sitting at the top of it. The trust will be here managing the assets, kind of controlling the assets. Underneath it, the trust will own some shell companies. Each one might be in a different jurisdiction. So you might have a trust in one jurisdiction whose trustees are somewhere else, whose beneficiaries are somewhere else, which owns offshore companies somewhere else. Each of these companies might then own assets. So that they might own, a bank account, a racehorse, a yacht, a painting, a portfolio of shares or whatever.
There are numerous variations of trusts and offshore secrecy structures. There are offshore lawyers whose work entails the creation of ever more complex and obscure structures. The aim of these structures is to hide the identity of the owners of offshore assets and allow offshore wealth to be recycled back into global markets.
But looking on the amount of money being administrated from tax havens, you see that it is a curve going like this. And all the talking we have been doing along with other wonderful people fighting against tax havens has not changed anything, It is the word where you say, go on talking, and go on talking, you're interesting me, and I'm going on doing what I want to do. We know everything today because we have had the Panama Papers, we have seen it, and we are not able to act upon it. And we are not able to act upon it because this system is really protecting the few people that are having benefit from it. And these are in percentage very few people, but they are powerful. And I see in the Panama committee that I'm sitting in, the only thing that could change this is to have a public accessible register of the beneficial ownership of trusts and of all kinds of companies. It is easy.